The first thing you would notice was the smell. Not smoke exactly, but the memory of it. Old ash trapped in damp wood. The kind that clings long after a fire has finished eating. Beneath that, something sour and sweet, like rot warming in the sun. Bones don't scream when they break, but people do. And somewhere in that cabin, years before anyone bothered to listen, something had screamed until it learned that screaming was useless. There were boards nailed over windows from the inside, not to keep thieves out, but to keep eyes away. Inside those walls, bloodlines bent inward like wet branches, folding back on themselves until names stopped meaning what they were supposed to mean. Father became brother. Sister became mother. The words stayed the same, but their bones were rearranged. When the fire finally came, small, accidental, quickly forgotten, it didn't cleanse anything. It only sealed the smell deeper into the beams. The house survived. The secret survived longer. Long before records were checked, before anyone asked who belonged to whom. The land already knew. The soil darkened in places where nothing would grow. Animals avoided the clearing, circling wide as if they sensed something malformed beneath the roots. At night, the woods carried sounds that didn't match the wind. Not cries exactly. More like breath being held for decades at a time. There are stories like this in every forgotten region. People pretend they are exaggerations. Folklore meant to frighten children into obedience. But folklore is usually just history that learned how to whisper. If you're listening now, take a moment. Which city are you hearing this from? And what time is it where you are right now? Just think it. Don't rush it. The answer matters more than it should. Because what happened here did not happen quickly. It unfolded slowly the way rot does, quietly, patiently. The kind of decay that looks stable until you press on it, and your finger sinks through. The cabin sat far from any road worth naming, folded into the Ozark Hills, like it had grown there rather than been built. No power lines, no mailbox, no sound of engines. Just a structure hunched under the weight of its own years, leaning as if exhausted by what it had been asked to hold. People passed near it without knowing. Maps showed the land as empty. Census lines skipped it. Paper forgot what flesh remembered. Inside, a family lived by rules that were never written down, because they didn't need to be. They were passed hand to hand, mouth to ear, blood to blood. Stay inside. Trust only us. The world poisons what it touches. We are all that's left that's clean. And somewhere in that closed circle, a child was born into a family tree with no branches left, only loops. Nothing had been discovered yet. Nothing named. Nothing proven. But the ground had already started to give way. The Ozark Hills do not announce themselves. They rise slowly, layered and folded, as if the land itself is trying not to be noticed. Old maps from the early 20th century show gaps where names should be, stretches marked only by contour lines and hand, written notes like timber or unsettled. These were places people passed through, not places they stayed, unless they wanted to be left alone. The cabin stood in one of those gaps. County records from the 1920s mention a parcel of land deeded to a man whose name appears only once, misspelled, then never corrected. No follow-up, no tax disputes, no transfers. After that, the land simply vanished from official concern. It wasn't abandoned. It was ignored. And in places like this, neglect is a kind of camouflage. Locals, the few who lived within walking distance, didn't use the family's name often. Names carry weight. They said the people up the ridge, or the ones past the creek. Children were warned not to wander too far, not because of bears or sinkholes, but because some folks don't like visitors. That was the polite version. The real reason stayed unspoken. The hills preserved silence well. Sound died quickly among the trees, swallowed by bark and moss. Even gunshots flattened into dull thumps. If someone cried out, you would have to be close to hear it, close enough to already be involved. The family had been there for generations, or at least that's what people assumed. Time blurred when no one checked it. A man and a woman were seen occasionally in town decades ago, buying salt, flour, lamp oil. They paid in cash. They didn't linger. When asked about children, they smiled in a way that ended the conversation. Church records listed no baptisms. School rolls held no matching names. A few births were rumored, then forgotten. Winter passed. Summer passed. Children grew without witnesses. The cabin itself was built with a care that bordered on obsession. Thick beams, hand-cut and fitted tightly, as if whoever raised it feared intrusion more than weather. Inside, rooms were small and deliberately dark. Light reveals things, shadows keep them soft. By the time the child was born, the one people would later talk about in lowered voices, the family had already sealed itself off completely. No visits, no trades, no neighbors crossing the line marked by a shallow ditch and a row of stones half sunk into the earth. What little knowledge filtered out came through accidents. A hunter glimpsing movement through trees. A woman finding footprints in the snow that appeared and vanished without explanation. A sound at night that didn't belong to any animal known in those woods. The hills watched all of it without comment. They always do, and inside that cabin, where no clocks marked the hours and no calendar marked the years, a child opened its eyes for the first time. Already bound to a history it would never be allowed to understand. The child was never announced. There was no cry carried down the ridge, no neighbor summoned, no record inked into a book. Birth happened the way everything else did in that cabin. Behind closed doors, under rules that could not be questioned. Blood soaked into rags and floorboards, then was scrubbed away with lye, until the wood went pale and rough. They said the child was quiet, too quiet. Even as an infant, it did not wail the way babies are meant to. It watched. Eyes open longer than they should have been, tracking movement in the dim light, as if already learning what not to ask. The woman who held the child kept her face turned away when others were near, not out of shame, but instruction. She had been taught since girlhood that certain truths were not to be reflected back at you. Looking too closely invited punishment, so she rocked and fed and cleaned without naming what she was. The man watched everything. As the child grew, it learned the shape of the cabin before it learned words. The slope of the floor near the hearth. The loose nail by the doorframe that snagged skin if you brushed past too quickly. The low beam you had to duck under, even when you thought you remembered it. Pain was an early teacher. Silence followed close behind. Outside, the woods pressed in, thick and wet, alive with sounds that never crossed the threshold. The child was not allowed past the stones. When asked why, the answer was always the same. The world out there takes things. Here, you are safe. Safety was a word that tasted wrong. Even then. In town, years passed without anyone seeing a child's face. Some assumed there were none. Others assumed there were many. Rumors need no evidence to multiply. They only need absence. When the child was old enough to walk, it began to mimic behaviors that unsettled even the adults. It stood too close. It watched too intently. It reacted to anger before anger was spoken, shrinking or stilling in ways that suggested long familiarity. At night, it sometimes woke screaming, not like a nightmare, but like recognition. As if it had remembered something It was not supposed to remember yet. Drawings appeared scratched into the dirt near the cabin. Circles within circles. Figures with too many lines connecting them. When the woman tried to smooth them away, the man told her to stop. "The child knows," he said. "Let it learn." Animals avoided the clearing more noticeably then. Chickens refused to lay. A goat birthed a still kid with fused legs, and was slaughtered before anyone could look too long. The remains were buried shallow, and the ground never settled back properly. The child asked questions only once. It pointed at the woman, and then at itself, and then at the man. It made a shape in the air with its hands, folding something invisible back into itself. The man's response was immediate and violent. Not loud, not chaotic. Controlled. Afterwards, no one spoke of it again. That was the moment something locked into place. Not just obedience, but understanding. The child learned that knowledge itself was dangerous. That blood was not just something you carried, but something you were trapped inside. And still, more children would come. The second child arrived during a winter that refused to end. Snow packed itself against the cabin walls and stayed there, hardening into gray ice that smelled faintly of ash and animal fat. The birth took longer this time. The woman screamed despite herself, the sound tearing loose and flying into the trees where no one heard it. Afterwards, she wept without noise, her face turned to the wall, her body already learning how to disappear. The first child watched. By then, it was old enough to understand that pain was expected, that blood meant continuation, not alarm. When the crying stopped, the child brought water without being asked. This was not a kindness. It was training. The man spoke more after that, not gently, instructionally. He explained the world as a place that devours families, that dilutes them until nothing recognizable remains. He spoke of blood as if it were soil, something that had to be protected from contamination. He told stories about ancestors who kept to themselves and survived while others collapsed into chaos. None of these stories had dates. Dates invite verification. The children grew with no sense of sequence. Days bled together. Seasons were marked only by what could be hunted and what could not. They learned to read faces instead of books, tension instead of clocks. The woman was both comfort and warning. The man was law. At night, rituals emerged without ever being named. Lamps extinguished in a precise order. Hands washed 3 times. Doors checked. Then checked again. The children learned that repetition kept danger away. What danger was, no one said. It was everywhere. And that was enough. The third child came years later, and by then the first no longer thought of itself as a child. It had become something else. An echo of the man's watchfulness, a mirror of the woman's fear. It corrected the younger ones when they spoke too loudly. It repeated rules before they were broken. It drew new circles in the dirt, more careful this time, lines intersecting in ways that felt deliberate. The youngest was wrong from the start. Slow, soft. Its head shaped strangely, its fingers bending in ways that made the man avert his eyes. He called it weak, but he did not send it away. Blood was blood. You did not discard it. The woman spent longer holding this one. She whispered to it when the others were out of earshot. Words that contradicted nothing but comfort itself. Each time she did, fear followed. She watched the door. She listened for footsteps. The woods began to respond. Dead animals appeared closer to the cabin than before. A deer collapsed near the stones, its legs tangled, its eyes clouded. The man said it was a sign. Of what? He didn't explain. In town, someone mentioned seeing smoke at odd hours. Another spoke of children's voices carried on the wind. No one connected the dots. They never do until the picture is finished. Inside the cabin, the family tree folded tighter. Roles blurred. The children were taught who they were allowed to love and who they were never allowed to question. And above all else, they were taught this: if anyone ever asks who you belong to, you give the answer you were given. The truth was not just hidden, it was being rehearsed. The nights grew louder before anyone realized they had changed. Not louder in volume, but in texture. The woods no longer sounded empty. Something in the rhythm was wrong. Pauses stretching too long, insects cutting off at once, as if listening. Inside the cabin, sleep fractured into short, shallow stretches. The children woke standing, not knowing how they had left their beds. The eldest began to speak in sentences that felt borrowed, words shaped like the man's voice, but arriving without his presence. Marks appeared on the walls, not scratches, not quite writing. Lines pressed into the wood with a steady hand, then rubbed smooth, then pressed again. The woman scrubbed until her palms split, but the impressions returned, faint and stubborn. As if the cabin itself was remembering, rituals deepened. The man insisted on them now. Before meals, after meals, before sleep. He spoke of keeping the circle closed. He drew diagrams in ash on the hearthstone, loops that turned inward, arrows that never pointed out. The children were made to trace them with their fingers until the shapes felt natural, until direction itself lost meaning. The eldest began killing animals without being told. Small ones at first. A rabbit snared too tightly, a bird crushed instead of released. The man watched without correction. "This is learning," he said. The woman said nothing. Her silence had long ago become another rule. The youngest screamed at night, not from dreams, but from pain no one could see. Its bones shifted as it grew, joints bending incorrectly, breath catching where it shouldn't. The man blamed weakness. The eldest blamed disobedience. The woman blamed herself, quietly, endlessly. Drawings grew more elaborate. The dirt near the cabin filled with figures that shared faces. One body, two heads. One head, two bodies. Lines connecting them like veins. When rain washed them away, they reappeared closer to the door. Once, someone came too near. A man from town, lost or pretending to be. His voice carried through the trees, calling for directions. The family froze. The man took his rifle. The eldest stood beside him, heart pounding with something that felt like anticipation. The stranger never reached the clearing. He turned back on his own, later claiming he felt watched. That was enough. After that, the man burned old papers, letters, a book with names written carefully inside. Ash floated through the cabin and settled on the children's hair like gray snow. The past was being erased while it was still alive. The eldest began to understand the shape of the secret without ever hearing it spoken. It felt it in the way the man watched the woman, in the way the younger ones clung to her, in the way mirrors were covered, reflections avoided. Identity became something dangerous, something that could fracture if stared at too long. By then, the woods had stopped pretending nothing was wrong. Even the wind moved differently around the cabin, skirting it, bending away. The place had become a knot in the land, and knots, eventually, must either be untied or cut open. The truth did not arrive all at once. It never does. It surfaced in fragments, in moments when the rules failed to hold their shape. A word used incorrectly, a look held too long, a slip in the careful choreography of silence. The eldest was the first to understand it, without being told. It happened during a winter evening, when the fire burned low, and the shadows grew long enough to overlap. The youngest lay coughing, its breath rattling in a way that made the woman's hands tremble. She pressed the child to her chest, rocking, murmuring sounds that were older than language. The eldest watched the curve of her body, the familiarity of the gesture, the way the man stood apart, eyes fixed not on the child but on her, something aligned, not emotionally, structurally, like realizing two bones belong to the same skeleton. The eldest remembered the drawings, the circles folding inward, the rules about mirrors, the way the man flinched when anyone spoke about resemblance. It remembered the question it had once asked with its hands, and the violence that followed. The answer had been there all along, punished before it could be spoken. Mother and sister were the same word here. Father and brother were never separate. The family tree had collapsed inward so completely that roles had fused. What should have branched had doubled back, again and again, until the children were born not from lineage, but from repetition. The same blood moving through different shapes, carrying the same mistakes forward like an inherited command. The man confirmed it without meaning to. He spoke that night of purity, of preservation, of how the outside world rots families by introducing strangers into sacred bonds. He spoke of duty, of continuation, of how some lines are meant to close, not spread. The woman did not look up. Her silence was no longer obedience. It was surrender. The eldest felt something tear loose inside its chest. Not horror, recognition, a sickening sense of inevitability. This was not an accident. It was design. A doctrine practiced so long it no longer felt like a choice. The younger ones sensed the shift without understanding it. Children always do. The air thickened. Touch became confusing. Comfort carried an edge it hadn't before. The youngest cried harder, as if its body knew what its mind could not name. From that point on, everything made sense in the worst way. The deformities, the delays, the way pain repeated itself across bodies like an echo, the way love here always came with conditions and fear. The secret was no longer just hidden. It was shared, and shared secrets rot faster. Outside, the woods held their breath. Inside, the family continued as it always had, now bound not just by blood, but by the knowledge that there was no version of this story that could survive light. Something had been revealed, and once revealed, it could not be folded back into silence without consequences. When the truth began to leak beyond the trees, it did not do so cleanly. It seeped. It bled into the margins of conversation, into glances held a second too long, into the way people avoided the road that passed closest to the ridge. No one said incest. No one said blood. They said wrong. They said unclean. They said that place should have burned years ago. It started with the animals. Chickens in nearby yards stopped laying. Dogs refused to track deer trails that angled toward the cabin. A cow birthed a calf with twisted legs and was put down before sunrise. In rural places, coincidence is tolerated until fear gives it a pattern. Once it did, the town's restraint evaporated. The church noticed next. A pastor who had never set foot near the ridge preached one Sunday about corrupted lineage, about sins that repeat themselves through generations if left unchecked. He never named the family, but everyone knew which direction his eyes drifted when he spoke of fire as mercy. A small group went up the road one night without announcing it. They told themselves it was concern. Curiosity dressed up as duty. They carried lanterns, not crosses, and their steps were hesitant, as if the ground itself might object. They never reached the door. From the edge of the clearing, they saw enough. A child standing barefoot in the dirt, watching them without expression. Marks on the walls. The woman's face pale and emptied of something human. The man's posture, defiant, unafraid, already certain of his righteousness. No one spoke on the walk back down. By morning, the story had changed shape. It always does. Some said there were more children buried out back. Others said the man had been doing this since his own parents were alive. Someone claimed the woman had never been given a choice. Someone else said she had. Truth fractured into versions that allowed everyone to carry only the piece they could stand. What followed was not justice. It was erasure. Records disappeared. Old schoolhouse ledgers were burned behind the church. A family Bible, once kept by a clerk who didn't know what it contained, vanished. When someone finally went back to the cabin with the intent to destroy it, the fire spread faster than expected. Dry beams, old oil, years of waiting. The flames did not roar. They collapsed inward, eating the structure from the inside out. The roof fell first, then the walls. Smoke hung low and bitter, carrying the smell of secrets released too late. No one spoke of who lit it. Afterward, the land was declared unsafe. Cursed, some said. Others called it mercy. The family was gone, where no one agreed. Some said the man was taken in the night. Some said the woman walked away with the children before dawn. No one checked closely. The town wanted an ending, not an answer. Silence returned, thicker than before. But it was different now. It wasn't ignorance. It was choice. And beneath the ash, beneath the trampled grass and half-buried stones, something remained. Proof does not need a house to survive. Sometimes it waits. It was nearly 20 years later when the past surfaced again, not through rumor but through paper. In the early 1980s, a researcher working out of a regional university archive requested a box no one had touched in decades. It was mislabeled, pushed behind municipal budgets and zoning disputes, its contents dismissed as clerical debris. Inside were fragments, half-burned forms, photographs curled at the edges, medical intake cards with names crossed out and rewritten in different hands. What caught her attention was repetition. The same woman's face appeared in 3 separate hospital admissions, each under a different name, each spaced years apart. Each time, the notes mentioned complications. Each time, there was no discharge record tied to a child. Just a blank where continuity should have been. The researcher followed the trail outward. County birth indexes offered nothing. School records were empty. Church logs had gaps that felt intentional. It was as if someone had taken a blade and carefully removed a family from the narrative without disturbing the surrounding text. Then she found the photographs. They were not meant to be seen together. One was a grainy snapshot attached to a welfare report that had never been filed. Another was a medical photo, clinical and cold. A third came from a real estate survey taken before the fire. When placed side by side, the faces aligned too closely. Same eyes, same asymmetry, same expression that looked less like fear and more like expectation. She requested DNA analysis from samples preserved in hospital pathology storage, something rarely done then, buried under layers of approval. The results came back slowly, reluctantly. The patterns were unmistakable. This was not distant relation, not cousins, not even first-degree overlap disguised by time. This was collapse. A family tree folded inward until there was no outside branch left to anchor it. Parent and sibling sharing the same genetic markers, children carrying compounded errors, stacked generation over generation without interruption. The researcher listened to audio tapes next. Interviews recorded after the fire, never transcribed. Voices strained, evasive. One man repeated the same sentence 3 times, each slightly altered. We thought it was their business. We didn't know for sure. We didn't want to be wrong. On the final tape, a woman's voice cracked. She spoke of a child who looked at her like it already knew how the story ended. She spoke of circles drawn in dirt, of a house that smelled like smoke even before it burned. The report was completed and quietly circulated among academics and state officials. No press release, no announcement. Some truths are corrected administratively, not publicly, but the researcher could not let it rest. She visited the land where the cabin once stood. Nothing remained but a depression in the earth and a scattering of stones. The forest had moved back in, efficient and indifferent. Still, she felt it. That sense of something unfinished. Proof had been found, names restored, lines drawn where none had existed. But knowledge does not undo damage. It only names it. And once named, it asks a final question. The last question was never written in the report. It lingered instead, unspoken, hovering at the edge of every conclusion, like a bruise you stop pressing but never forget. What happens to a person when the first truth they learn about themselves is also the most forbidden? The children did not return to the hills. Their names appeared later in sealed documents, medical evaluations, psychological notes written in careful language that tried not to sound like judgment. They were described as quiet, observant, slow to trust. Their bodies carried the history first, the bones that didn't quite align, the pauses in speech. The nervous systems tuned permanently to threat. Minds followed more slowly, tracing the outlines of an origin story no one wanted to explain all at once. One of them asked, eventually, not directly, not with the words people expect. It came out sideways, the way trauma always does. Why do mirrors make me feel sick? No one answered honestly. Not yet. The woman survived longer than the man. That much is certain. Records show her entering care under her own name for the first time in her life, trembling as she signed it. Therapists noted how she spoke of love as something dangerous, something that must be rationed carefully, or it would consume everyone involved. When asked about the past, she described it as a closed room with no windows. She did not want it opened. She only wanted it locked from the outside. The land was sold, then resold, then left alone. People who tried to build there complained of headaches, of livestock miscarrying, of an unease that settled in the chest without explanation. Eventually, no one tried anymore. The researcher published her findings in an academic journal few would ever read. Footnotes replaced whispers. DNA charts replaced rumors. But something was lost in the translation. Paper can explain structure, not sensation. It cannot reproduce the feeling of standing in a place where identity collapsed inward until it crushed everyone inside it. Years later, someone asked her why she kept digging when the town had clearly wanted to forget. She paused before answering. Because forgetting is how it started, she said. Because silence is how it survives. Stories like this don't end. They recede. They wait for new soil, new isolation, new people convinced that cutting themselves off will keep them pure. That harm only comes from outside. That blood knows best. Somewhere right now, a family is closing ranks, teaching their children which questions are dangerous, drawing invisible circles and calling them safety, believing that love, when twisted tightly enough, can become law. So here is the only question that matters, the one no record can file away. What would you do if you discovered that the person who gave you life was also the one you were never meant to love? There is no marker where the cabin stood, no sign to warn you, no plaque to explain what the earth once held. If you walked there now, you would think it was just another patch of Ozark ground. Trees leaning close, leaves stitching shadows together, insects singing their endless, indifferent song. Nothing about it asks to be remembered. That is how places like this survive. The story does not live in the soil anymore. It lives in habits. In families that teach obedience before language. In children who learn early that love can be conditional. That silence can feel like safety. That blood is something you inherit along with fear. It lives in systems that wait for paperwork before they listen to bones. The people involved grew older. Some healed in fragments, some never did. Healing, like harm, moves unevenly through generations. You can stop the fire, but you cannot burn the wood. You can name the crime, but you cannot unknot the years that taught it to feel normal. What remains is not outrage. Outrage burns too fast. What remains is discomfort, the slow, crawling awareness that this did not require monsters, only isolation, certainty, and time. That the most dangerous ideas are often the quietest ones, passed down like heirlooms, never questioned because they have always been there. Somewhere, a child will ask a question they are not supposed to ask. Somewhere, an adult will decide whether to answer honestly or preserve the shape of the lie. That moment is where stories like this are either repeated or broken. The Ozark cabin collapsed, but the warning did not. It waits in the spaces where no one is watching closely, where the road feels too long to bother driving, where silence feels polite. And now that you've heard it, the silence belongs to you too.